All right, minions, this is episode 28 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. What is this podcast? I'm writing a book that will hopefully overthrow global capitalism in the short to midterm future. And I am taking my disorganized fragments, which I've handwritten into composition notebooks, typing them into my computer, and then before sorting them into their proper categorical chapters, reading them into a recording device so you can get a live experience of my writing process. I tell the jokes I enjoy telling, not the jokes the audience will understand. All right. Multi-party socialism fragments. CIBCOM is a Spanish company working to create industrial planning systems for socialism. Perhaps the final uprising of the people will be a riot against the obligation to coexist with anarchism. Class versus Identity chapter fragment. The Russian Revolution was able to succeed precisely because Russia is a more conservative country than the West and was not hampered by the internal disruption of call-out culture which prevents the Western socialist movement from functioning. Lenin dealt with the Bauman affair correctly, and the implications are much larger than the specific case. The simplicity of Russian culture also made revolution more obvious than reform, with the direct path being preferred over the indirect. In addition, of course, to the greater severity of Russian material conditions. Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter fragments. We may be compelled to fight in every direction against every type of threat. Only an absolutely rigid political system is capable of withstanding such an assault. Warhammer 40,000's Emperor of Mankind had a phase as a revolutionary dictator, attempting to subvert the Spacer Guild's aristocratic monopoly on warp travel by building a webway of artificially constructed passages through demon-infested warp space. Time is running out chapter fragment. This book is written for nerds, for hipsters, and people seeking the most niche and underground topic possible. It is also written for everyone because the whole species faces climate-induced social collapse. Why Regime Change chapter fragment. You can't do both will be a recurring theme in this book. Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter fragment. The central reality of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which seems rarely if ever articulated, is that it can take an individual or collective form, and an oligarchic or democratic form, depending on the phase of the struggle, with the individual or oligarchic form usually occurring during the revolutionary crisis, and the collective or democratic form being the more permanent form. Everyone has their own theses, everyone is fighting their own reformation. A functional family in the pre-revolutionary period is a family that discusses Marxism at the dinner table. That's the movement chapter. Another dictatorship fragment. If you can control one room, you can control the world, but you have to control the world to even control one room. Comedy fragments. Watching C-SPAN is like the movie Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. They motion like they'll do something, and it never quite occurs. Why Regime Change chapter fragment. The crumbs which the Democrats throw us are bigger than the crumbs the Republicans throw us, but they're still crumbs. The Democrats may be an implicit labor party at a very low intensity, but they will always be a capitalist party. Time is running out chapter fragment. The revolution was interrupted by COVID. Why Regime Change chapter fragment. After the Bernie Sanders campaign, everything has changed. The urgency of the cost of living crisis is greater than ever, but all avenues of change through the established channels have been foreclosed. Multi-party socialism chapter fragment. We must combine revolutionary socialism with democratic socialism. National Refoundation chapter fragments. Nations are a reality with which we have to deal. We don't need to be invested in preserving the European ethnic history of the USA, but it's certainly a present and future reality we have to navigate. What happens in the United States defines the entire world. America doesn't have to be the global evil empire to be overthrown. America is a dystopia unto itself, oppressing its own citizens. American capitalism will be overthrown not by a foreign attack, but mainly and only by Americans rising up for their own freedom from the tyranny of capitalism. Declaration of National Refoundation chapter fragments. Capitalism is tyranny. We live under economic tyranny. It is no less a tyranny than the tyranny of the British Empire against which the nation was founded. We must imagine that even George Washington would be compelled to admit the anti-democratic nature of modern capitalism if he was confronted with all the facts. The iron-booted rule of the corporations and the super-wealthy is much more of an arbitrary rule by a group separate from the American people than any colonization of America by a foreign power ever was. The very existence of the ruling class is poisonous to the people. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. The class war versus the culture war question is a distinctly American issue. It's possible that Americans might accept socialism on democratic grounds, but the American majority is unlikely to ever accept leftism. Americans are normal people, not leftist weirdos with extremely strict cultural politics. Declaration of National Refoundation. Who was more oppressed, modern Americans under capitalism, or the American colonists under the British Empire in 1776? This is the question that will tip the scales of history from American capitalism to American socialism, and by extension, from global capitalism to global socialism. I am the most advanced Marxist in South Jersey. I outrank Bernie Sanders. I outrank Slavoj Žižek. West and the Rest, Geopolitics Chapter Fragment. It's true that authoritarian communism is in some ways a progressive force in the Third World for development, but in other ways it is simultaneously a reactionary force. Parallel Government Chapter Fragment. Simulate the ultra-real scenario of being a parallel government forming itself out of a small group in a modern-day setting in whatever country you're in. If you're doing a role-playing game, instead of role-playing a legislature that's already big and has already taken power, role-play like you're just a group of people sitting around a table or a conference call, building a movement around your micro-parallel government in embryo. I prefer the ultra-real scenario for the role-playing game of role-playing a parallel government. Declaration of National Refoundation, Chapter Fragment. If we could find it within ourselves to overthrow the tyranny of the British, there is no good reason we should not overthrow the greater tyranny of capitalism. Dictatorship Chapter Fragments. Lenin's dictatorship was an intellectual dictatorship. A country or a planet is like a ship. Everyone in or on one is stuck sharing a fate together. During crises, democracy is not possible, and emergencies are declared, which suspend the normal functioning. During these times, governments effectively operate without democracy. Even pirate ships, which were democratically run, elected captains for times when votes could not be taken, such as combat. Countries and planets need captains too. Why regime change? Chapter Fragment. To change society, you have to break all the rules. Parallel government. Chapter Fragment. A parallel government or provisional government could be infiltrated by forces opposed to it, including the previous or current ruling order. They may try to pressure a parallel government towards prioritizing reform demands, power sharing with an unjust regime, whether a dictator or a capitalist legislature, or even self-disbandment. We resist these outside influences by resisting these internal errors. We must keep in mind that we are being continually pressured toward these errors, not only by infiltration, but also by the intrinsic hardship of our task, as well as by the false consciousness dominant in our general environment due to ruling class control of media, with this false consciousness being dominant not only in society generally, but also regarding strategic questions within social movements. This is to say, most of the social movements have false consciousness on questions of social movement strategy due to the false consciousness across society generally. Combat Chapter Fragment. You can take and disarm prisoners during an ambush instead of combat. This is one way to accumulate arms. Class versus identity. If you don't uphold the benefit of the doubt for the accused, I don't want to work with you. National Refoundation Chapter Fragment. It's sad when you realize you don't live in a free country, but it's a band-aid we've all got to rip off. Why regime change? Chapter Fragment. There is no ethical cognition under capitalism. All our intentions are bad, all our thoughts are evil. Multi-party socialism. Chapter Fragment. Stalinist, quote, democracy, unquote, is participatory but intensely policed against dissent. There are mass meetings of workers and you can speak at them, but if you say the wrong thing, you go to jail. How the movement grows over time. Chapter Fragment. With parallel government, theory becomes practice, firstly because parallel government is such a pivotal and unknown concept. Main veins of Marxism. Chapter Fragments. The problem with both democratic socialism and Trotskyism is that they're both deeply flawed and yet both indispensable. Long live the Third Campus Protestant Reformation, saving Trotskyism from Trotsky's own errors. Class versus Identity chapter fragment. The Protestant Reformation is iconic due to its onset resulting from the brave declaration of dissenting ideas and forbidden thoughts. The strategy of monolithic class focus is just such a forbidden thought requiring to be bravely declared, and will start just such an avalanche. Nonviolence chapter fragment. Guerrilla warfare is Hollywood fantasy in developed countries. It makes for great movies and terrible strategy. Comedic guerrilla warfare, or movement building through entertainment, might work. Why regime change chapter fragment. It is correct for the vanguard to feel exasperated by the majority. Nonviolence chapter fragment. In many ways, hacking is secondary to the organization Anonymous, which is more about creating a collective identity in opposition to the status quo, united around certain aesthetic symbols in movies. In one sense, celebrity figures like the Wachowskis, Keanu Reeves, and the weirdly overlooked Hugo Weaving, who played not only Agent Smith in The Matrix, but also V in V for Vendetta, are a dominant force in the global protest movement for providing a unifying aesthetic. In another sense, they're not leaders at all, because they're not providing plans for systemic change, which would work in reality, only agitating for change without a blueprint toward it. In this way, these celebrities are ironically the simulation of a revolution which must be bypassed to reach the real thing. Capitalism is Bad chapter. Okay, I'm supposed to look up an article called Capitalism and Extreme Poverty, about how actually capitalism put a big dent in the incomes of the global south rather than just bringing them up. Why regime change chapter fragment. Electoral participation leads to abandonment of socialism in practice every time. Because it drags you towards social democracy, and then you're not really doing socialism because you're not ever getting to socialism. Okay, National Refoundation chapter fragment. Capitalism is the ultimate national security threat. Crowd Revolution Strategy chapter fragment. Explicitly challenge security forces to engage in passive civil disobedience by declining to do their job duties in dispersing protests. Capitalism is Bad chapter fragment. The housing market is torture, inflation is torture, and the ever-increasing rate of exploitation is also torture, whose rate of increase continually accelerates, so that the torture is not only ever-increasing, but the amount by which the torture is increasing is also continually increasing, hence acceleration. West and the Rest, Geopolitics chapter fragment. What is needed is an international tendency of revolutionary democratic socialism, spreading a strategy of parallel government, crowd revolution, and flipping the pillars. At first, this should be more of an intellectual trend than a formal organization, and it could include various parallel governments, revolutionary organizations, study groups, or all of these, as well as independent individuals engaged in conversation. Why regime change chapter fragment. We must make revolution the top priority. West and the Rest Geopolitics chapter fragment. It's shocking how much Call of Duty Black Ops 2 depicted the necessary direction of a global crowd revolution wave against all capitalist governments, including the West and China, as well as across the Third World. Why regime change chapter fragment. Various critics of the system believe they are enlightened for finding a balance between reform and revolution, including all variety of socialists, anarchists, and liberals, but in fact they need further enlightenment. Fascism chapter fragment. The Office of Strategic Services of World War II never was truly discontinued. Truman kept it going during the Cold War despite hesitations that all intelligence services were too similar to the secret police agencies of totalitarian states. He initially dissolved the World War II OSS, but revived it in the form of the CIA under congressional pressure as the Cold War started up. What was intended as a temporary wartime measure became a permanent facet of society. In the 1970s, the CIA blackmailed lawmakers using surveillance of their sex lives. Hoover and Angleton did this. Truman called for the abolition of the CIA, which he started after the JFK assassination in a newspaper article. The CIA spied on the Vietnam anti-war movement and used disinformation to disrupt organizations during Operation Chaos, including spying on Martin Luther King Jr. as proven by the church hearings. Build cadre through study groups. That's the movement building chapter. During the British General Strike in 1926, the Stalinized Third International told the British Communist Party to follow the lead of the trade unions instead of leading a revolution. Predictably, the trade unions did not carry the general strike all the way to revolution, because that's intrinsically not what trade unions ever do as bargaining units under capitalism. In this way, the British communists made the same exact mistake which Amadeo Bordiga criticized during the Red Biennium in Italy, botching a revolutionary situation by accepting the leadership of the intrinsically reformist trade unions rather than leading the formation of a revolutionary government independently of the trade union bureaucracy. West and the Rest Geopolitics Chapter Fragment. Gaze deeply into the mirror of Asia, past the exoticized Orientalist facade of Stalinist communism and Maoist guerrilla warfare, and we only see Western capitalism reflecting back. Why Regime Change Chapter Fragment. Split early instead of engaging in entryism. This is the lesson of the Bolsheviks versus the German communists. The fear is we shouldn't split early because we'll be too small to influence anything, but without splitting early, we end up getting subsumed into the larger group and abandon our goal of shifting its politics, instead adopting its politics. Movement building. We need deep and thorough political education. National Refoundation Chapter. Rather than hating on WASPs, American socialism will succeed by embracing WASP values of extremely dry analytic rationalism, a Protestant/Leninist work ethic, and the Taylorist engineering of scientific management. These were already the values practiced by Lenin, who lived in London and admired American manufacturing. As usual, the mirror of the East points us back to the West. Movement building chapter. Popular leaderships are built not from coercion but persuasion, as well as by theory and funding. So Trotsky said, we have to play the part of the fire hose. It is often the duty of a revolutionary organization to advise against direct action. Movement building chapter. The formation of a parallel government can lead to spontaneous premature attempts to disband the ruling government, like the July days. Why regime change? In a letter to American Trotskyists, Trotsky wrote, for the majority of those socialists, I have in view the governing strata. Their socialism is a side issue, a second-class occupation accommodated to their leisure hours. These are not intellectual opponents, but class enemies. Class versus Identity chapter. Leftist misandry drives men to the right wing. Dictatorship chapter fragment. There is an extreme overlap between Nietzsche's Übermensch and Lenin's vanguard. Both are an elite possessing greater knowledge than the majority and who resist various social conventions. Rather, I should say, who disobey various social conventions. Time is running out, chapter fragment. What is needed is a strictly political accelerationism, which accelerates the revolutionary process rather than accelerating technology or collapse. Further, the accelerationism we really need is one that addresses the increasing speed of the global crisis, and the way its increase in speed is also speeding up. It is not just speeding up, but the rate at which it is speeding up is also speeding up, like an upward exponential curve. The one way we can use technology is by addressing human needs and ecological crises through massive socialist megaprojects of technology and infrastructure. Overhauling the energy grid down to zero carbon emissions is the ultimate socialist megaproject. As the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics says, the future needs to be constructed. This book aims to be the decisive breakthrough in the construction and invention of the future. National Refoundation chapter fragment. Let us return America to its past role as leader of the global revolution. Why regime change chapter fragment. Is rioting always accelerationist? It depends what you mean. It can be acceleration towards collapse rather than progress. Main Veins of Marxism, chapter fragment. And this is the end. We got through it. This book's thesis of parallel government as a central feature of revolutions is not only a general breakthrough, but a breakthrough within and for the Leninist tradition specifically, solving a central strategic question of how to attain power, which remained largely unsolved within classical Leninism and its reliance on the formation of workers' councils. The issue is not that Leninism has never acknowledged workers' councils, it centered them, or that Lenin never mentioned parallel government, he did briefly. Instead, the issue is that the question of what is to be done needed a more detailed and specific answer than Lenin's initial answers of building a revolutionary organization, socialist education and newspapers, protest, labor organizing, etc. There needed to be a more focused investigation of the art of regime change, both at the tactical level of insurrection, well covered by Malaparte's writing about the October insurrection, as well as the more social and political question of insurrection, addressed better by a general theory of parallel government. Well, that is the end of the episode. This has been episode 28 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast. Someday I'll get back to actually making coherent episodes, but right now I just gotta power through the incoherence. I gotta keep doing this. It's probably gonna be like 10 or 20 more episodes like this. And then things will begin to get a little more coherent, though I may take a hiatus for a while to, do some editing of the chapters. Once all these fragments are sorted into the correct categorical chapters, then I got to actually turn the chapters into readable, coherent, final products, or at least drafts. Because right now the chapters are just as scrambled as this flow of fragments, because I'm just sorting the fragments into categories, and those categories are the chapters, and then I got to turn those scrambled chapters into readable chapters. So this is the writing process. You're getting to see how the sausage is made, and it's not pretty. I know this is a very weird podcast that is often not very appealing in terms of its sheer non-linearity, in terms of its just disorganized nature. This is not, an anti-capitalist comedy podcast, but this is not, a bunch of bros bantering, a bunch of girls bantering. This is not banter. This is very serious work. And you can't always make things fun. You can't always make things appeal to those of short attention span. You can't always make things appeal to, nihilistic entertainment seekers. Sometimes you have to do the real thing in all that's completely dry, prosaic boredom and tedium. And that's what I'm doing here. And if you're along for the ride, you're pretty tough, honestly, to be able to even stand listening to any of this. So I appreciate it if you do. This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast, episode 28, part 11 of the Random Fragments series, signing off.